For this lesson, then, we're going to investigate the intensity factor with the secondary colors. The first step is to set up your chart. Depending on the size of paper that you're going to use for your chart, you'll want to separate the page into equal rows and columns. So I'm using about 1 inch for each row and 1/2 inch in between each row. But I didn't take into account the 5th row. So I would recommend doing about 1 inch for each row. Leave a space at the top for labeling and a space to the left for labeling of your rows. Maybe 1/4 inch between columns so that you can have 1 inch for each row. I'm using 1/8 of a sheet of watercolor paper, which is 7.5 inches by 11 inches. You can do the chart bigger if you want to so that you have more space, but I think that is a good size. So you'll want to create a chart with 3 columns, 1 for each secondary color, orange, green, and violet. And you'll want 5 rows. Unlike the chart in the upper right of your screen, you'll want 5 good rows. So once you have your columns and your rows set up, I recommend doing the chart initially in pencil so that you can erase while you're still fiddling. Then in pencil also label your columns. You don't have to go in the same order, but I've done orange first column, green the second column, and violet the third column. And depending on which pigment you've chosen to purchase, I've used Paranone Orange, I believe, by Daniel Smith, Sap Green by Daniel Smith, and Cobalt Blue Violet by Daniel Smith. You may have a different complement of colors, but put in the name of those, both the pigment name or hue as well as the brand name for future reference. And then label your rows. The first row will be a graded wash without any other paint, just the secondary color. The second row will be use the secondary color mixed with the titanium white watercolor pigment. The third row will be the secondary color mixed with gouache white. The fourth row will be the complement of the secondary color. So for orange, the complement is blue, but you have 2 blues. So 1 row will be the warm version, and the 5th row will be the cool version. Now we're going to get our paint ready, so I'm bringing out the 3 secondary colors, orange, green, and violet, into different mixing wells. And then I also want to tape down my chart so it doesn't scoot all over, so I'm taping it down to some gator board. Getting all the extra utensils out of the way. Remember to overlap the tape at the corners especially. So pull the tape off, measure it first, and then rip. We're not going to go completely to the edges, so it's not as critical to overlap, but just good habit to keep going. I like to work at a slant when I'm doing graded washes, so I'm bringing out a little, what I call an easel light that I have in my studio. So for this first row, we're going to first do our orange. So what I want to do is a graded wash. Now you did this in a previous lesson. So I'm going to get the strong pigment to start with on all the rows. In the first row, I'm just going to complete a graded wash. So how do we do a graded wash? We weaken the pigment as we go with our Escarres so that we have the strong pigment at the top and then slowly get weaker as we go. We can see that this also lowers the intensity of the pigment. So we can lower the intensity by adding water to the pigment. By the end of the box, we're going to be hardly any pigment at all. So the most intense will be at the beginning. Alright, so now I'm going to take an extra little plate and now I'm going to add white to the pigment in varying degrees. Just a tiny bit at first. And now I'm going to put a step of just slightly lighter orange. And you can see when we add the white, the color gets less intense. So I'm going to slowly add more and more white. This is very similar to how you might paint in another media like acrylic or oil painting. So slowly we're going to make the orange less intense by adding more and more white. This is the titanium white watercolor pigment, which is not quite as opaque as the gouache pigment that we'll use in the next row. Okay, now I'm going to take my gouache pigment. This is by Reeves, it looks like. Reeves gouache, and I'm going to do essentially the same thing I did before. I'm going to take a little bit of my orange direct pigment. I like to put white pigment on a different place because I don't want to pollute my palette with the white because it gets into everything. So just a little bit of the gouache first. We're going to see if there's any difference between the titanium white and the gouache. Which do we like better? Which do we like worse? So this is the purpose of doing all these charts, is so we can make these decisions before we get into a critical subject painting or abstract painting, if that's your thing. But you can see as we get closer and closer to white, the pigment gets less and less intense. So the most intense is when it doesn't have anything. It's fully saturated state at the top, in this case, of the column, but we're working this sideways. Alright, so now I have to do one of the blues. So in this case, I'm going to start again on my little plate, and I'm going to bring over my intense. Now we want to keep the orange pigment very strong and saturated. And I'm going to add one of my blues. So for this first row, I'm going to start with the warm blue, just a little bit. You can see that adding the complement, I want to keep this as strong as possible, so keep getting the water out of your brush. But you want to clean your brush a little bit. So we're going to start with just a little bit of the complementary warm blue. In this case, I have ultramarine blue by Holbein, and I want to make sure I label that. Now I'm going to add a little bit more blue to the same pile of orange, and I'm going to slowly get closer and closer to blue. On the other end, you can see that now the color gets closer and closer to black. So essentially what we're doing is adding all three primary colors, because the orange is made up of red and yellow, and now we're adding blue. And that decreases the intensity in the other direction. Instead of closer and closer to white, now it's getting closer and closer to black. So at the end of the thing, you should be close to black. Alright, I'm going to clean off my palette here and move on to another secondary color. Alright, I just wanted to zoom in here a minute and just talk about what we did. So this is the Peridone Orange, and now I'm going to work on the Cascade Green by Daniel Smith. So let me zoom out a little bit, and similarly to what I did before, I'm going to work with the green pigment. Now I've accelerated this video a bit so that we can get through the process and show you the whole process without taking up too much more of your time. So this first rectangle is a graded wash. I've moved the row to become a column, and as I go down, I weaken the pigment. As you can see, the pigment gets less intense as it gets lighter. So that's one way of adjusting the intensity, is to add more water. Then I move on to the next row, which will be adding white to the pigment. In this case, watercolor titanium white, which is opaque, but not quite as opaque as a gouache. So we're going to do both gouache and titanium white. So I'm going to pull out my green again. I'm going to get strong pigment to start without any addition of any other pigment for all the rows. Now I'm going to take my titanium white and put it on another plate. I like to put it on another surface so that it doesn't get into my palette and skew all my colors. It has a tendency to contaminate my colors and take the intensity down. So I want to keep it separate. So I'm going to pull out just a little bit of white and make my next swipe. Add a little more white. Add a little more white to the pigment. And as you can see, the white also, adding white to any pigment also decreases the intensity and in other words, it makes it less bright. So we'll move down to the end of the square, continually adding more white. Moving on to the gouache. I'm using Reeves gouache. Reeves' kit gouache came in a kit of all the colors of gouache. It's a little more opaque than the watercolor titanium white. Gouache is a watercolor pigment. They're just, all the colors are opaque. I believe they've added chalk to all pigments in order to make the gouache opaque, but I don't know that for a fact. I'd have to look it up, do some Googling. So as we go down, we continuously add more white. So these are secondary colors, meaning they're a mix of two primary colors. Okay, so now I have to figure out what the complement of green is, which is red, and I want to put both my warm and cool of the primary complement. So every secondary's complement is a primary color. So I'm going to start with the warm red, add a little bit of it. And you can see this neutralizes the color or makes it less intense. So a neutral is a less intense version of the color. Neutralizes it a little bit. I'm going to continue to add more red to the pigment. I'm trying to keep most of the water out so that I'm not adjusting the water level now, I'm adjusting the color. So any complement of a color will neutralize that color and make it less bright. So intensity is a measure of brightness versus dullness. Value is very similar, but it's a measure of light to dark. So remember, we're testing for intensity with this particular lesson. And so now we're, instead of getting closer and closer to white, we're getting closer and closer to black or gray, or brown, which are all neutral colors. So different combinations of the primaries will lead to gray. If you get a true complement, it tends to lead to gray or black, whereas an almost complement will produce a lot of brown tones. So on this secondary color, I've decided to make sure I also test for the other red. So if, in this case, if I've used the warm red, now I want to use perhaps the cool red. you're required to have both. There are a variety of reds that are cool and a variety of reds that are warm. I only ask you to have one of them in your arsenal for this course. So I'm going to put my sneaky little column there. Hopefully you've planned better than me and you've put in 5 rows instead of just 4 like I did. So just want to test the same green against a different red. So in this case I'm going to be using a cool red, which is quinacridone red. It's slightly cooler than the Puro red. It's not an extremely cool red, but it is cooler than the Puro red that I used in the other section. Once again, you can see it produces a lot of browns. In this case, I have found that if I want to get to gray quickly, instead of brown, I like to start with more of the blue colors. A lot of people use ultramarine blue and like a burnt sienna to get to a gray tone very quickly. I don't find that to be completely gray or neutral gray. I think a blue and an orange make a very good gray. You have to get more to a pure gray. Stephen Quiller is a renowned watercolor artist, water media artist in the US, and he has a whole chart on what makes the perfect grays. So now I'm going to go back and do the orange, the other temperature of orange. So before I believe I did the warm blue, now I'm going to do a cool blue, which is my phthalo blue. Sorry, you can't see that. It's kind of off screen, but I'm using my phthalo blue green shade mixed with orange. And we'll see if this is a significantly different result. Do we stay in the brown tones or do we move into more gray tones? I think that turned it pretty neutral gray compared to the other warmer blue that we mixed with orange. And then I'm going to not forget to label that. I'm just using the code that we used in the Chi formula, is just using the bias as a sub letter. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the last secondary color, which I'm using cobalt blue violet. So I would say this is a blue violet, not a red violet, and not a neutral violet. It's very blue dominant. So I'm going to be sure to write that in there so I know what pigment I've used so I can reproduce this in my actual paintings. And I'm using Daniel Smith. So the opposite of blue is yellow. So I'm going to do both a yellow with a red bias and a yellow with a blue bias ultimately on this test. So hopefully you enjoyed that music. I didn't have anything new, so we just did the graded wash, added white, and then added titanium white watercolor, and then the gouache as we did with the previous two secondary colors. So now we want to do the yellows. So yellows get messed up pretty easy, so make sure you clean up the yellow when you start. So now I'm doing the cool yellow first. This is the yellow with the blue bias. And we'll see how close we get to neutral gray, or if it just ends up being in the brown tones. We'll see what happens. So now, since the cobalt blue violet is actually a darker color than the yellow, as we add more yellow, we'll end up with a lighter color rather than a darker color as we add more and more of the complement. So if we start with a darker color and add a lighter color and add a darker color, we get closer to a darker black. Now this one, since we're getting the violet lighter, it'll end up being more of a high value gray than a low value gray as we proceed down. So the darker colors is when there's just a little bit of yellow of the complement added. I hope that makes sense. So I'm having a little bit of trouble keeping the water out. So I really want this to be a test of complements and not a test of how light the color is in terms of adding water. So you can see this is a lot lighter gray than it was at the beginning of the test. Okay, so now I'm going to use the other complement. So I'm going to start with my pure cobalt blue violet. And now I'm going to add a little bit of the more orangey yellow. And we'll see if this ends up more gray or more brown. But both of them will be neutral. So you can see the first part where I just add a little bit of yellow will be closer to black. As I add more and more yellow, I'm going to get actually lighter gray or brown tones. So you can use this when you're painting to decide what brown you want to get if you're doing a landscape, for instance. How do you get a brown tone really quickly? By adding the complements. I'm going to go back and put the pure test back on that fifth squeezed in row. Right, so that's my chart. The last part of the process is to label it a little better so that I can see it better. So I'm just using a permanent ink marker, in this case the Sharpie brand, and I'm writing over the top of my pencil marks that I put in previously, so I didn't forget what I was using. So just to recap these complements as well, you're going to use the color wheel chart to kind of determine what the complements are. So the complement of orange is blue, so I've used both the warm tone blue in the bigger row and the cool blue in the smaller row. And then for green, the complement is red, so I've used both the, looks like cool red first and then the warm red second. So in the violets, it looks like, to me, the cool yellow and the blue violet make a better gray. So you'll want to evaluate your results and see which one is closer to a real neutral. Overall, you can see the purpose of the chart, though, is to evaluate intensity, specifically using secondary colors. Adding water, white, or a complement will reduce the intensity of a color.